Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Men Among the Ruins by Julius Evola. This is the third Evola book that I will have reviewed. The first one was Revolt Against the Modern World, and then I reviewed sometime later Handbook for Right-Wing Youth. And that was a long time ago. Revolt Against the Modern World, I believe, approximately 5.5 years ago that I reviewed that book. Seems like a million years ago. And I recall at the time that I had said that I wanted to go back and reread the book because I felt like it took me a while to kind of grasp hold of what he was talking about. And by the end of the book, I felt like I wanted to look at it again, knowing what I knew when I had finished the book from the outset. I didn't do that. I didn't go back and reread the book. I had other things I wanted to read. I had a long list of books. I still have a long list of books. The list of books never gets any shorter. But I think actually now that I am going to go back and reread Revolt Against the Modern World, because I've certainly read a lot of books since then that have given me a little bit more insight, I think, into some of the things he was saying, particularly The Birth of Tragedy by Friedrich Nietzsche and Sexual Personae by Camille Paglia both talked about Apollo and Dionysus. And I would like to go back and look at Revolt Against the Modern World with that in mind. And also, I've read much more Carl Jung. I have certainly read a lot more Carl Jung since then. I had only really dabbled a little bit at the time. And so maybe I can bring some of that to bear as well. And I've read more about paganism, and I've read more about the early Greeks, the Greek gods, Greek religion, and maybe I can bring some of that to bear as well. But anyway, that's not this book. That's coming down the pipeline, a revisitation of that. But for now, probably more important that I get into the meat and potatoes of this one. Men Among the Ruins is really I believe this is really his primary political book. Although some politics enters into some of the other things that he's written, certainly. Evola writes a lot about the occult and magic, and he's written about Buddhism and things like that. And so that stuff comes into this book a little bit as well, but maybe not to as much a degree as in some of his other writings. We're looking much more at some political insights in this one. And I have to say that as interesting as I find a lot of Evola's ideas, I can't help but find that he's not really my favorite writer. And this really comes down to his just writing style. I find him to be excessively vague and not too clear in what he's describing. I think it could be clearer. I think he could make himself more well understood rather than making sort of oblique references to things. If he was maybe a little more explicit, I think I would prefer that. Maybe it's a matter of taste. But that's neither here nor there. I want to get into some sections here where he talks a little bit about nationhood, what the nation is, and what the state is, and what society is, and how these things relate to one another. So, of course, I'm going to read some sections like I always do, and I'm going to start here where he says the following. He says, quote, "The state is under the masculine aegis, while society, and by extension the people, or demos, are under the feminine aegis. Once again, this is a primordial truth. The maternal domination, from which the political virile principle subtracts itself, was also understood as the domination of Mother Earth, and the mothers of life and fertility, under whose power and tutelage existence was believed to unfold in its physical, biological, and collective material aspects. The common mythological background is that of the duality of the luminous and heavenly deities who are the gods of the political and heroic world on the one hand, and of the feminine and maternal deities of naturalistic existence, who were loved by the plebeian strata of society on the other hand. Thus, even in the ancient Roman world, the idea of state and of imperium, i.e. of the sacred authority, was strictly connected to the symbolic cult of the virile deities of heaven, of light, and of the superworld, in opposition to the dark region of the mothers and the chthonic deities. The same ideal line runs through the themes found in primitive societies, i.e. Mannerbund, up to the central bright motif of the Olympian state tradition of the classical world and several superior Indo-European civilizations. Later on in history, this line leads, if not to the imperium, to the divine right of kings, where there were no groups created by the power of a right, there were orders, aristocracies, political classes, defined by disciplines and dignities that cannot be reduced to social values and economic factors. Then the line was broken, and the decadence of the state idea, parallel to the degeneration and the obfuscation of the pure principle of sovereignty and authority, ended with the inversion throughout which the world of the demos and the materialized masses emerged on the political horizon, engaging in the struggle for power. Such is the primary meaning of any democracy in the original sense of the term, and of every kind of socialism. In their essence, they are both anti-state and represents the degradation and contamination of the political principle. Both democracy and socialism ratify the shift from the masculine to the feminine, and from the spiritual to the material and the promiscuous. This is an involution, the basis or counterpart of which is an involution occurring within the individual himself, expressed by the inner triumph of faculties and interests connected to the naturalistic, obtuse, and merely vitalistic part of the human being. According to the correspondences already acknowledged by Plato and Aristotle, injustice, namely the distortion and the external collective subversion, always reflects the internal subversion, that which is present in a given human type that has prevailed in a given civilization. End quote. So a couple things to take note of here. He starts off saying the state is under the masculine aegis, while society and by extension the people or demos are under the feminine aegis. Once again, this is a primordial truth. And he goes on from there and talks a little bit about masculine deities and feminine deities, mothers and chthonic deities, as opposed to the virile deities of heaven, light, and the superworld. So we're talking about a division between the gods in the ancient world, and the state was concerned with heavenly gods, the gods of light, the Olympians, and the common people were more concerned with feminine gods, goddesses, mother goddesses, goddesses of the harvest, and earth goddesses. So sky gods and earth goddesses is this sort of distinction that he makes. This was a prevalent part of revolt against the modern world as well. This distinction corresponds roughly with the distinction between Apollo and Dionysus that I earlier mentioned. And he says that this association of the state with the masculine aegis and the people with the feminine is a primordial truth. And one has to wonder here what we're getting into when we talk about primordial truths. I've brought up the gods and goddesses at different points, obviously, if you've been a listener of the show, when I discussed Plato and elsewhere, and their correspondence with their connection to archetypes of the subconscious or metaphysical structures of reality. To what extent can we confirm some sort of a distinction between the masculine principle and the feminine principle as metaphysical components of reality? Do such concepts as the masculine and the feminine have any reality above and beyond the human consciousness. Now, obviously, even absent human consciousness, there remains male creatures and female creatures, and they're also, it can be more involved as just simple concepts, perhaps extracted from the biological reality of male and female, where we say the sun is associated with masculine energy and the moon is associated with feminine energy. How concrete is such an association? Is it subjective? Could we say that the earth is feminine because it receives light and rain from above, from the sky? The sky gives forth light and moisture and rain into the earth, and that's a sort of positive and negative, a assertive and receptive principles, something giving, something receiving, and in that sense, that could be sort of primordial, a deeper concept that maybe male and female biology reflects something deeper in metaphysics, in a distinction between two things. How much can a materialistic worldview accept the idea of metaphysical structures that are not necessarily defined in what we know of the material world? The material world perhaps reflects something deeper than the material world. And how can that be? Or is it really just various ways that we categorize things by noticing similarities? We notice some similarity between different parts of reality, and by the similarity that we notice, we create principles, we identify principles, we define principles, and we find them to be so commonly repeated in different parts of reality that we ascribe metaphysical primordialness to these concepts. I don't know, but it's very interesting, and if you're a listener of the show, you know I'm a pretty strict materialist, and yet stuff like this does intrigue me. Evola is an interesting character in his own way, because while he constantly refers to things like the sacred or the spiritual or what have you, he also constantly refers to gods and goddesses. I don't believe he ever really asserts a belief in God, especially God as we understand it in the quote-unquote Judeo-Christian tradition. Evola's, I haven't read enough of Evola to be able to really say what he believes, but he wrote about Hermeticism, he wrote about Buddhism, he was considered a practitioner of magic, he was into the occult. What does that really mean for his understanding of what spirituality is? What does that mean for his understanding of what the gods are? Are they beings? Are they just metaphysical structures? Do they have a sort of transcendence? And what does that transcendence mean? It's sometimes hard to extract from his writing what he actually believes. It seems as though he often boils things down to this dichotomy of male and female. Everything seems to revolve around this male and female. And maybe male and female themselves are, as I said, like representations of something more primordial than that. But he talks about a sort of upward direction, things moving upward, coming from above, and a downward direction. Everything seems to be along this separation between the upper and the lower, the upper being superior and the lower being inferior. And this distinction has in and of itself a sacred or spiritual quality to it. It has a metaphysical truth deeper than the basic material reality. And then the concept of spiritual truth itself is a sort of upper concept, and then materialistic, naturalistic, base matter and reality is a lower phenomena. And the distinction between upper and lower is tied in with the distinction between masculine and feminine. And this separation of these two ways of being, these two ways of interpreting phenomena, is prevalent all throughout Evola's writings. And does that mean that he believes in a god and a goddess? In other words, that these two principles are divine in themselves and possess some... I guess the question is, does he believe that these things that he refers to as sort of spiritual primordial truths, does the upper world, the spiritual world, contain a consciousness, a multitude of consciousnesses, or is it something that is outside what we would consider conscious? Maybe I haven't read enough Evola to answer those questions, but it always seems a little bit vague, and it seems like he really just kind of ascribes the very concept itself of higher and lower as being sacred concepts, and something that should be recognized all the time in all of our endeavors. And we should always be striving to the higher, because we should be striving toward the sacred. And while sometimes this might seem to echo the standard common modern Western religiosity of having a sacred component to our lives, or having some sort of recognition of the divine in life, most modern Christians, I think, would ultimately, once they dig into Evola enough, reject an awful lot of what he believes. So I don't know. It's certainly interesting, and as I said back in my review of Revolt Against the Modern World, I'm constantly sort of reinterpreting what he says to fit my own worldview. And that's okay. That's just sort of how I feel like I have to read Evola. So let's keep reading. He says, quote, "The previously mentioned gap between the political idea of state and the physical idea of society is found again in the opposition between state and nation. The notions of nation, fatherland, and people, despite their romantic and idealistic halo, essentially belong to the naturalistic and biological plane and not the political one. They lead back to the maternal and physical dimension of a given collectivity. Wherever these concepts were emphasized and bestowed with the dignity of a primary element, this has always happened in a revolutionary or even polemical function toward the concept of the state and the pure principle of sovereignty. With the passage from the expression, 'by the grace of God,' as approximate and stereotypical as it was, it still designated the true right from above, to that of 'by will of the nation,' what really occurs is the above-mentioned inversion, which is not a shift from just an institutional structure to another, but also a shift from one world to another world, separated by an unbridgeable hiatus. A brief historical overview will clarify this regressive meaning of the myth of the nation. The origin of this myth should be traced to the deviation proper of those European states that, while acknowledging the political principle of the pure higher sovereignty, assumed the form of national states. This phenomena had an essentially anti-aristocratic, i.e. anti-feudal, schismatic, and anti-hierarchical function vis-a-vis the European ecumene, in that it refused to acknowledge the superior authority of the Holy Roman Empire and conferred an absolute anarchical character to the particular political units over which the individual princes ruled. These princes, after they ceased to receive support from above, sought their support from below, and pursued a policy of centralization destined to occasion their downfall, since a more or less formless and inarticulate human conglomerate increasingly gained preeminence. Thus they shaped the structures that eventually ended in the hands of the nation, first understood as the Third Estate, and later on in the hands of the nation understood as the people and the masses. This shift, as it is well known, was brought about by the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, the nation emerged in an exclusively demagogical function. Since then, the nationalism allied itself with revolution, constitutionalism, liberalism, and democracy, becoming the symbol of the revolutionary movements that from 1789 to 1848, all the way to 1918, were responsible for subverting whatever remained of traditional Europe's preceding order. These patriotic ideologies were responsible for the upheaval in virtue of which a given naturalistic factor, such as that of belonging to a particular stock and historical society, is transformed into something mystical and assumes a supreme value. In this context, the individual matters only as citizen and as child of the fatherland. The cumulative unity of citizens eventually detracts from authority, undermines or subordinates every higher principle to itself, i.e. to the will of the people, beginning with the principle of sovereignty. We know what high consideration the social matriarchate held in Marxist historiography. It was regarded as the primordial social constitution and the original state of justice, which were ended by the institution of private property and by the political forms associated with it. However, the regression from the masculine to the feminine is equally visible in the previously mentioned revolutionary ideologies. The image of the fatherland as mother, as land of which we are all children, and before which we are all equals and brothers, clearly recalls that physical, feminine, maternal order from which men separate themselves in order to create the virile and luminous order of the state, while the physical order, per se, has a pre-political character. Moreover, it is a very significant fact that country and nation have prevalently been allegorized through feminine figures, even among people whose land had a neuter or masculine rather than a feminine name. The sacred character and inviolability of nation and of people are merely the transposition of features attributed to the Great Mother in ancient plebeian gynecocracies, and in societies that ignored the virile and political principle of the imperium. Thus, it has rightfully been suggested by Bachofen and by Stedding that men uphold the idea of state, while feminine natures, which are spiritually matriarchal, side instead with fatherland, nation, and people. This casts a sinister light on the nature of the influences that have been predominant in the political history of the West, beginning with the French Revolution." End quote. Okay, so interestingly here, he is talking about the nation. He says, like the distinction between state and society, this is really similar to the distinction between state and nation. And it's almost restating the same thing, that the nation, or the fatherland, and the people essentially belong to a naturalistic and biological plane, not a political one. So a nation, or defined as like a kind of similar to a tribe, a group of people who are defined by, let's say, blood and soil. Let's take that definition of nationhood. When you talk about something like blood and soil, you're talking about nature. You're talking about naturalistic biological phenomena. And those sorts of phenomena, in Evola's view, are of the lower and feminine realm. So nature, and nationhood, and nature and nation gain their etymological source from, I don't know the Latin word, but that original NAT letter combination that they both share relates to birth. The nativity, natal. That's a word that comes from, or a set of letters that comes from a Latin word, basically meaning birth. And so nationhood in that sense is attributed with the feminine. And it's sort of all of the people of the nation they share brotherhood or sisterhood. They share kinship with one another in the same way that a bunch of children are all brothers and sisters in a family, and they share a mother, right? They're all the sort of equality of all of them. They're all equal children of the mother and the father, but it's not. It's the same biological birthing family kind of domain. It's not the domain of authority. It's not the domain of the state. He says that leaders push themselves out of and beyond and above the nation to position themselves into the domain of the political. And in the creation of the state, there is a separation from the nation, and the nation and the state are somewhat in opposition to one another in that same way. Now, opposition is the right word, but in a contrast with one another. And he attributes this to the French Revolution. He really attributes the birth of what we presently understand as a nation as being something born out of the French Revolution. Many nationalists in the modern era might recoil at the idea that nationalism was born in the French Revolution. Most modern nationalists tend to have a somewhat sour view of the French Revolution, despite the sort of nationalistic qualities that may have come through in the French Revolution, or even have found their origins in the French Revolution. This is all very interesting sort of critique of nationalism and nationhood, something that I tend to really think is a very positive and necessary development in our world, but it could be seen as something that is a degradation of something that could be even higher and better, which would be more of a monarchy. But nevertheless, a monarchy may have its own, qualities, and the political domain and the state and the imperium and the things that Evola values may have their own importance and their own sort of right-wing character to them, and should be considered as elements of how we want to structure our societies. Perhaps not, depends on your position, but you certainly run the risk of kinship, bloodlines, and what we understand and value as nationhood, and as our tribe, and as our race, and things of that nature, take a very distinctly subordinate position, potentially, in the face of a kingdom and monarchy that isn't based on such base things, such lowly things as bloodlines and geography. And as I get to some other sections that I'm going to read here, that comes up sort of again, that there's something higher than just things like kinship, blood, soil, nationhood, things of that nature. They should be, in Evola's view, subordinate to something higher, which is more of a spiritual ideal. And how similar is that to the concept that we so often abhor, that America is an idea? We recoil at that. America is not an ideal. It is a people, and it is a place. And those are two deeply opposed positions. And sometimes it seems like Evola could be interpreted as arguing that we're better off, at least, if we determine that America is an idea, because then it enters the realm of the sacred and not the realm of the material. Anyway, moving on from there, he says, quote, "An idea embraced by fascism. was that the nation exists and has an awareness, a will, and a superior reality only in service of the state. This idea has a special historical confirmation, especially in reference to what Vico called the right of heroic peoples, and the origin of the main European nations. Even though fatherland certainly means land of the fathers, the term could have acquired this meaning only a very long time ago, since the historical fatherlands and nations known to us, almost without exception, have been established in lands that were not the primordial ones, and in any event in areas wider than the original ones. Their establishment occurred through conquests and aggregative and formative processes that presuppose the continuity of a power, of a principle of sovereignty and of authority, as well as the bond of a group of men sharing the same idea and loyalty, pursuing the same goal, and obeying the same inner law, reflected in a specific political and social ideal. Such is the generating principle and the basis of every great nation. Understood in naturalistic terms, the political nucleus therefore relates to the nation in the same manner as the soul and entelechy is related to the body. It shapes it, unifies it, and makes it partake of a higher life. In reference to this, we could say that a nation exists and overcomes geographical and even ethical boundaries whenever we find the reproduction of the same inner form, namely the consecration or the imprint bestowed by the higher political force and its representatives. Thus it would be absurd, for instance, to call ancient Rome a nation in the modern sense of the word. One could refer to it as a spiritual nation or as a unity defined by the Roman man. The same applies to the creations of the Franks and the Germans, as well as the Arabs who spread Islam, to cite just a few examples. Maybe the most significant case is the Prussian state, which originated from a knightly order, a classic example of a Mannerbund, namely the Order of Teutonic Knights, which later on became the structure and the form of the German Reich. Only when the tension decreases do differences become attenuated, and the group of men gathered around the supraordained symbol of sovereignty and authority weakens and crumbles. Only then may that which is a byproduct and an artificial creation, i.e. the nation, become autonomous and separate itself, thus acquiring the appearance of a living entity in its own right. Then what emerges is the nation as people, collectivity, and mass, namely, that which such a concept has increasingly signified since the French Revolution. When a sovereignty is no longer allowed, other than one that is the expression and the reflection of the will of the nation, it is almost as if a creature overtook its creator. From the political class, understood as an order and a Mannerbund, a shift occurs to demagogues and to the so-called servants of the nation, to the democratic ruling classes who presume to represent the people, and to acquire for themselves various offices or positions of power by flattering and manipulating the masses. The natural and fatal consequence of the above-mentioned regression is the inconsistency and most of all the cowardice of those who, in our time, constitute the political class." End quote. So interestingly, here you have this idea that the nation is formed by a group of men. He uses the word Mannerbund. He's really talking about an order of men initiated into a militant order or a brotherhood of some sort with sacred with a sacred underpinning to it. A post-initiation membership in a exclusively male organization. And he talks about the concept of the fatherland and the nation. And he says that the nations of Europe were established by these groups of men, these Mannerbunds, these orders, these knightly warrior orders. And they were established by kings and their associated orders and their hierarchical military structures that didn't originally come from Europe anyway. And so you have the nation being something created by the pre-existing military order organized along spiritual ideals. And so that when the nation breaks free from such exclusive groups based on ideals and becomes something on its own and claims its own sovereignty, that the nation has its own sovereignty and that the will of the nation, the will of the people of the nation should guide the course of the nation, is like a creation turning on its creator. Yeah, it's interesting because ultimately he doesn't really have a lot of good things to say about nations and nationhood, particularly as something that should be held up as an ideal or as a mechanism for political organization. The nation could exist, but he says, according to like a fascist idea, the nation really only has a reality in the service of a state. It only has an awareness or a will. It really only exists in service to the state on account of the primordialness, the priority of the state and the political class, the political organization. So let's keep reading here. He says, quote, action through myths, namely through formulas lacking any objective truth, and that appeal to the sub-intellectual dimension and passions of individuals and the masses, is the inseparable counterpart of the aforementioned political climate. In the most characteristic modern trends, the notions of country and nation display to an eminent degree the quality of myths, susceptible to receiving the most varied content depending on which way the wind blows, and on the political parties, with the only common denominator being the denial of the political principle of pure sovereignty. We may add that the system that was established in Europe through the advent of democracies, i.e. the majority system based on universal suffrage, is characterized from the start by the degradation of the ruling class. In fact, the majority, being free from every restriction and qualitative clause, is necessarily on the side of the lower social strata. In order to win the favors of these strata and be elected to office by their votes, it will always be necessary to speak the only language they understand and to give priority to their predominant interests, which are naturally the most coarse, material, and illusory, always promising but never demanding. Thus, every democracy is also a school of immorality, an offense to the dignity and inner code of conduct that ought to be the trademark of a true political class. I wish now to continue to discuss the genesis of the great European nations in service of the political principle, in order to derive some orientations. The substance of every true and stable political organism is something resembling an order, a mannerbund, in charge of the principle of the imperium, comprising men who see loyalty as the basis of their honor, as the saying of the Saxon Code goes. But in time of crisis and of an overall moral, political, and social disintegration, as is the case in our day and age, a generic reference to the nation does not suffice for reconstructive work, unless such an idea assumes a revolutionary overtone, including elements of a properly political order, weakened to various degrees. The nation will always be a promiscuous entity. In the above-mentioned situation, what needs to be done is to emphasize the fundamental duality of the origins. On the one side stand the masses, in which, besides changing feelings, the same elementary instincts and interests connected to a physical and hedonistic plane will always have free play. And on the other side stand men who differentiate themselves from the masses, as bearers of a complete legitimacy and authority, bestowed by the idea and by their rigorous, impersonal adherence to it. The idea, only the idea, must be the true fatherland for these men. What unites them and sets them apart should consist in adherence to the same idea, rather than to the same land, language, or blood. The true task, and the necessary premise for the rebirth of the nation and for its renewed form and conscience consists of untying and separating that which only apparently, promiscuously, or collectively appears to be one entity, and in reestablishing a virile substance in the form of a political elite around which a new crystallization can occur. I call this the realism of the idea. Realism because what are needed for this work are strength and clarity, rather than idealism and sentimentality. The realism, however, is opposed both to the coarse, cynical, and degenerate realism of politicians, and to the style of those who abhor ideological prejudices. The latter, in fact, are capable only of reawakening a vague feeling of national solidarity, a herd-like spirit, by means that do not really differ from the general techniques employed to arouse the excitement of the masses. All this falls below the level of what politics is in the virile, traditional sense. Moreover, it is inadequate for the times. It is inadequate because a realization of the idea is already present on the opposite front. In fact, today we can witness the gradual formation of blocs that have the supranational character proper to units essentially based on political ideas, as barbaric as they may be. This is the case of communism, in which the aggregating and uniting factor beyond nation and country consists of being proletarian communists belonging to the Third International. This is also the case of democracy, when it pretends to summon crusades. The so-called Nuremberg ideology established certain principles, not at all the only conceivable ones, even though they are supposed to be categorically upheld without regard to country or nation according to the official formulation, with precedence over the duty of obedience to the individuals toward the state to which they belong. In this way, too, we can see the insufficiency of the simple notion of nation as a guiding principle, and the need for its political integration in terms of a higher idea that alone must be the standard uniting and dividing factor. The essential task ahead requires formulating an adequate doctrine, upholding principles that have been thoroughly studied, and beginning from these, giving birth to an order. This elite differentiating itself on a plane that is defined in terms of spiritual virility, decisiveness, and impersonality, and where every naturalistic bond loses its power and value, will be the bearer of a new principle of higher authority and sovereignty. It will be able to denounce subversion and demagogy in whatever form they appear and reverse the downward spiral of the top-level cadres and the irresistible rise to power of the masses. From this elite, as if from a seed, a political organism and an integrated nation will emerge, enjoying the same dignity as the nations created by the great European political tradition. End quote. So there's certainly a lot there, and he's really just talking about the insufficiency and the inadequacy of the nation, and he's talking about the necessity for people to differentiate themselves from this. He says, what needs to be done is to emphasize the fundamental duality, to emphasize the distinction between the masses and a group of men who differentiate themselves from the masses as the bearers of a complete legitimacy and authority. This legitimacy and authority bestowed by the idea and their rigorous impersonal adherence to it. The idea, only the idea, must be the true fatherland for these men. He says what unites them and sets them apart should consist in adherence to the same idea, rather than to the same land, language, or blood. So, this is really setting the idea above the nation. Clearly, what unites these men is their adherence to the idea. So someone from some other land who is not a part of your nation, who adheres to the idea, is a closer kin, so to speak, a closer ally, a more enthusiastic and deeply connected participant in this order than people that are just share a bond of basic bloodlines and kinship. And this, and he even talks about the Soviet Union and communism as being, in some sense, demonstrations of this, despite the fact that their ideas are bad or degenerate. Nevertheless, he said, this is specifically what he says, today we can witness the gradual formation of blocks that have the supranational character proper to units essentially based on political ideas, as barbaric as they may be, and that's the case with communism. The aggregating and uniting factor beyond nation and country consists of being proletarian communists. So that communism can unite all these different nations into one supranational entity, one multinational entity that adheres to a common idea. This is like the post-war order, right? The global order, rules-based order that we hear so much about. Post-war liberalism and the West. The West is united only by its adherence to ideas, so that any nation on the earth that adheres to these ideas of democracy and liberalism and so on and so forth sort of becomes part of the West, becomes a part of this group in the same way that any nation could become a part of the global communist collectivity by embracing the idea. And this is not something that I'm really all that fond of as a notion to kind of separate for people. And we already deal with a multinational elite. We already deal with an international elite trying to steer the course and positioning themselves as our leaders, not by the assent or confirmation or participation of the nation, not by the will of the nation, but by their own capacity to assert themselves through the superiority of their ideas, or supposed superiority of their ideas. They are the ones who truly know what is best for all of us. They are the ones who truly know what is the correct metaphysical understanding of how societies should be and what the nature of reality is and everything else, what the true objective morality is of, the liberal morality presents itself as like the pinnacle of moral judgment, and through their positioning of themselves as our moral betters is how they kind of allocate to themselves the capacity and the authority to rule over us. And while their ideas certainly aren't in accord with Evola's ideas, nevertheless, the very premise is in accord with what he's describing. So jumping from there to another spot where a later chapter he talks about the organic state. I'm not going to dwell on this for a tremendous amount of time, but I want to read this section where he talks a little bit about the organic state, what that means. He does make a sort of distinction between natural and naturalistic and organic. Interestingly, he says, quote, "The idea of the organic state was not born yesterday. This needs to be recalled both for those who have forgotten it and for those whose intellectual horizons are restricted to the polemics between fascism and anti-fascism, as if nothing else ever existed previously in history. The idea of the organic state is a traditional one, and thus we can say that every true state has always had a certain organic character. A state is organic when it has a center, and the center is an idea that shapes the various domains of life in an efficacious way. It is organic when it ignores the division and the autonomization of the particular, and when, by virtue of a system of hierarchical participation, every part within its relative autonomy performs its own function and enjoys an intimate connection with the whole. In an organic state, we can speak of the whole, namely, something integral and spiritually unitary that articulates and unfolds itself, rather than a sum of elements within an aggregate, characterized by a disorderly clash of interests. The states that developed in the geographical areas of the great civilizations, whether they were empires, monarchies, aristocratic republics, or city-states, at their peak were almost without exception of this type. A central idea, a symbol of sovereignty with a corresponding positive principle of authority, was their foundation and animating force. Almost as if, thanks to a spontaneous gravitation, men and social bodies found themselves working in synergy. Though they retained their autonomy, they undertook activities that converged toward the same fundamental direction. Even contrasts and antitheses had their part in the economy of the whole. As they did not have the character of disorderly parts, they did not question the superordained unity of the organism, but rather acted as a dynamic and vivifying factor. Even the opposition of the early British parliamentary system was able to reflect a similar meaning. It was called His Majesty's Most Loyal Opposition, though it disappeared in the later party-ruled parliamentary regime. Reading G.B. Vico and Fustel de Coulanges helps us to realize the power that the organic ideal had in antiquity. The main thing that emerges in ancient forms is that unity in them did not possess a merely political character, but rather a spiritual and quite often religious one, the political domain apparently being shaped and upheld by an idea or general view that was also articulated in thought, law, art, customs, cult, and the form of the economy. A unitary spirit was manifested in a choral variety of forms, corresponding to the various possibilities of human existence. In this context, organic and traditional are more or less synonymous terms. The spirituality of the whole was that which occasioned the integration of the particular, rather than its compression and coercion. A relative pluralism and decentralization are essential features in every organic system. The criterion for this decentralization is that it can be accentuated in proportion to the degree to which the center enjoys a spiritual and even transcendent character, a sovereign, equilibrating power, and a natural prestige. An objective observer cannot help but find it odd that all these things have been entirely forgotten, despite the fact that not long ago, before the advent in Europe of liberalism, individualism, and revolutions, there were political systems that reflected, in a sensible way, some aspects of the organic idea, and these systems appeared entirely normal and legitimate in the eyes of most people. But this is also the reason for the aforementioned confusion about totalitarianism, and for the fact that, displaying a bovine obtuseness and playing into the hands of the communists, the Italian people these days repeatedly view and denounce as fascism any system different from those glorified by the apostles of democracy and the immortal principles. However, totalitarianism merely represents the counterfeited image of the organic ideal. It is a system in which unity is imposed from the outside, not on the basis of the intrinsic force of a common idea and an authority that is naturally acknowledged, but rather through direct forms of intervention and control, exercised by a power that is exclusively and materially political, imposing itself as the ultimate reason for the system. Moreover, in totalitarianism, we usually find a tendency toward uniformity and intolerance for any partial form of autonomy and any degree of freedom for any intermediate body between the center and the periphery, between the peak and the bottom of the social pyramid. More specifically, totalitarianism engenders a kind of sclerosis, or a monstrous hypertrophy, of the entire bureaucratic administrative structure. These structures become all-pervasive replacing and suppressing every particular activity without any restraints due to an insolent intrusion of the public sphere into the private domain, organizing everything into rigid schemes. These schemes ultimately turn out to be meaningless because, starting from a formless center of power, what eventually arises is a sort of intrinsic and gloomy enjoyment of this relentless leveling process." End quote. So the last section there, the last few paragraphs, or mainly the last paragraph, he's talking about totalitarianism and critiquing it, but he's talking about the organic state, and interestingly, he kind of says that the organic state does allow some significant degree of autonomy and freedom to the different parts. He says pluralism is a fundamental component of the organic state. And he's really talking about almost a sort of loyalty and dedication to the whole, so that all the different parts don't need to be ruled with an iron fist because they're all operating on the same page. They're all working toward the same goals. He talks about the opposition in the English Parliament referred to as, I believe he says, His Majesty's most loyal opposition. So there's a loyalty that forms the bond, and absent the organic state, what you wind up with is, let's see. He says in an organic state we can speak of a whole, namely something integral and spiritually unitary that articulates and unfolds itself rather than a sum of elements within an aggregate, characterized by a disorderly clash of interests. If the state or the people, the nation, really the state he's talking about, in a democracy, the state is in a sense a growth of from the people, an extension of the people. But if you're really just looking at an aggregate of political voices, an aggregate of voters, let's say, of course you're going to have this kind of chaotic competing forces. Now, I tend to be a fan of the idea of competing forces and competing interests within one political entity. The different branches of government, the president and the judiciary, the different houses, different political parties, kind of competing interests, keeping one another in check. This is the checks and balances that we talk about in constitutional democracies, and particularly the United States constitutional democratic republic. We deal with checks and balances and competing interests because they kind of keep each other in check and keep any one entity or person or group of people from going overboard with their own personal agenda, their own quest for power, that should some participant in the state go astray, the other participants can keep them from going too far astray. That's kind of the premise, and I think there's something useful and valuable about that. And the organic state doesn't seem to be built on competing interests. It's built on the idea that all these different parts can kind of go their own way, and even in their opposition, they remain loyal. The loyalty is what holds them in place, rather than some sort of totalitarian force that keeps everyone in place. They stay in place. They maintain their role, their function, their duty in the society and in the state because they are deeply loyal to it. They're bound up in it, and they're participants in it, and their interests are at least in some great part bound up and contiguous with the interests of the nation and of the state as a whole. So that's the sort of organic state, and you can't have an organic state when the first thing that you expect from your aggregate of individuals is that everybody's going to be going against one another. When you get rid of the sort of deep loyalty and the shared culture, you know, this is the thing about diversity. Diversity means largely different groups of people advocating for their own particular ethnic and cultural interests, or whatever type of ideological interest or whatever it may be, religious interests, different groups of people balkanizing, advocating for their own interests, and have to be kept all within one political unit through the application of force. So that's the kind of the distinction between the organic unity of a state and a people versus a totalitarian enforced unity. And then a few more sections I want to read toward the end when he talks about births, birth rates, populations. Those are some topics that had come up in the previous episode. And Evola seems to echo some of the things that were said there. So here he says, quote, "Among the factors of the disorder and crisis of modern times, besides those caused by processes of subversion that cannot be regarded as spontaneous, there are, unquestionably, others that have a natural character and wreak havoc only because a stand is not made against them. A particularly important factor of this latter type is the world's population growth. There is no doubt that if it were possible to reduce the world's population density to that of 3 centuries ago, while also retaining the current degree of material civilization, the social and economic problems that afflict the world population today would basically be irrelevant. In that event, we would eliminate, for the most part, situations that revolutionary forces exploit to their advantage. We could head toward a relaxation and a decongestion that would limit every activist frenzy, first among them those that pertain to the overall power of the economy, and greatly propitiate the return to normalcy, thanks to a new, wider, and freer space. However, it is well known that we are proceeding in the opposite direction at an accelerated pace. The alarm that was launched in the past, with the cry, "The races are dying," turned out to be false. Not even the destructions of a total war, which spared neither defenseless cities nor women and children, were able to stop the demographic growth even in the Central European countries, with the exception of Italy, in comparison to pre-war conditions. It is like standing before an avalanche that, as it continually gains ground, grows irresistibly, exacerbating all kinds of crises and disorders. We cannot help but reject the idea that this is not a matter of fate, but rather something that human beings could easily control. What we have here is a case of disproportion that exists in modern Western people between the control of the external domain and the control of the inner domain. Elementary forces of nature are controlled by technology so that they may serve man's wishes, or in order to prevent them from being harmful, and yet nothing is done about the population explosion, because then man would have to act upon himself, his prejudices and instincts. Modern man is increasingly losing this vocation, and the only domain he can flaunt is the ephemeral control he exercises on matter. It is well known, too, that the danger of overpopulation was warned of in the last century by Malthus. However, his starting point was totally materialistic and only relatively consistent. In any case, it is not the one I regard as decisive for the final solution of the problem. The real danger is not, as Malthus believed, that the means of subsistence and food supply may become insufficient for an overly increased world population. Considering all the measures that could be taken before we get to that situation, this danger would occur only in a distant future. Before reaching this point, many unpleasant things could happen that were not considered by the zealous apostles of continuous and uninterrupted progress. Even considering only the material plane, the crisis caused by overpopulation in our age and in the future appears in different terms. Overpopulation exacerbates the problem of how to employ the workforces. It also unavoidably intensifies production processes, which in turn, due to their determinisms, strengthen the demonic nature of the economy. The result is an increasing enslavement of the individual and the reduction of free space and of any autonomous movement in modern cities, swarming as though in putrefaction with faceless beings of a mass civilization. This is the most important aspect of the problem." End quote. So we get here some concern about population growth, the ballooning population. When I was a kid back in the 80s, people were still talking about population, overpopulation. But not many people talk about it anymore now that the birth rates in Western countries I shouldn't say Western, really Northern countries. This is in the former Soviet Union as well, in its territories. It's really the whole northern world, the whole basically white world, the developed world, finds the same problem. And in the third world, we find, at least has been for quite some time, I guess it's slowing down now a little bit, but the exploding population, that population explosion is happening in the third world. It's not happening among European people. It's not happening among white Americans. It is not happening among Japanese or South Koreans. It is happening among the members of the third world for various reasons that I discussed in the last episode. I won't repeat myself here. So the situation is not quite as Evola describes it, where we have this sort of broad overpopulation. What we have are very disparate birth rates among different groups of people. And the fact that we don't have a sort of globally somewhat uniform birth rate, and the fact that we have so easy means of travel, and we have so open and willing to be, accommodating in our political classes and in our liberals, we wind up with a massive migration crisis. This migration crisis isn't a problem of overpopulation. It's not a problem of collapsing birth rates. It's a problem of the combination of collapsing birth rates in some parts of the world and overpopulation in others. So it's not exactly as Evola describes it, but it's also the fact that we don't have to just endlessly increase the number of people on the planet. We don't have to always be aiming at procreate, more people. It's not the case that we're necessarily going to be better, where our societies are going to be better on account of ballooning populations. He talks about Malthus a little bit, but he says that we're not really going to crash into the problem of being able to feed everybody, because we'll come up with various ways to feed them. We're going to face other problems before we hit that point. Largely, those problems will come from density and from technology. But I think that overpopulation is something that we ought to at least give some thought to. He says that if the population were the same as it was 300 years ago, but we were to somehow able to maintain the material way of life, let's see, what exactly is the phrase that he uses, the current degree of material civilization, in other words, the present technology levels, while rolling back the population density by about 3 centuries, we'd actually be in a pretty good position, and an awful lot of the things that make up global crises would kind of fade away. We would have enough space. We wouldn't be, we wouldn't be on top of one another, and we wouldn't face an awful lot of the problems that we face if we didn't have so many people. That's an interesting idea from Evola, that if we just cut back our population dramatically, we could solve a lot of problems. I think we could solve an awful lot of problems, if not ours, meaning European and Western peoples, not our birth rates, but if the birth rates in other parts of the world, the rest of the world, would drop dramatically, an awful lot of problems would be solved. And maybe fundamentally, if there were just a lot less people. Everybody's afraid of eugenics and mass murder and everything else and genocide when you start talking about things like that. But let's be honest, if the population was about a third, the global population was about a third of what it is, maybe certain things would just be easier. At the very least, let's stop trying to increase the lifespan of people other than ourselves. So continuing on in the discussion of birth rates and populations, he says, quote, "In the political domain, we need to take a stand against the myth expressed in the formula, 'There is power in numbers.' Attempting to base an imperialistic policy on a demographic campaign was one of the serious mistakes of the fascist ideology that must be denounced without hesitation. The power of numbers is the power of mere brute masses. The power is in itself very relative because even herds need to be guided. Every true empire is born from a race of conquerors who conquered lands and peoples not because they suffered from overpopulation or did not have a place in the sun, but on the basis of a higher calling and qualification which allowed them to rule as a minority in foreign lands. Was it an impulse resulting from a complex and intolerable overpopulation that led the Romans, Achaemenids, Franks, Spaniards, and early Islamic hosts and the British of yesterday to conquest? Moreover, when we consider the phase in which the material dominion is integrated with spiritual factors, an even greater emphasis should be given to factors that cannot be reduced to mere numbers and to the power of numbers. There is more to say concerning the inner problems of a people. Wherever indiscriminate demographic growth is promoted or allowed to go unchallenged, we can expect the harmful effects of the law of natural counter-selection. The fact is that the inferior races and the lower social strata are the most prolific ones. Thus we can say that while the number of superior, more differentiated elements grows in arithmetic proportion, the number of inferior elements grows in geometric proportion, the result being a fatal involution of the human race. The collapse and disintegration of the great imperial organisms has often occurred for that reason, as if it were due to a low tide because of a monstrous expansion of the basis constituted by the promiscuous and proletarian element. We should recall here that the term proletarian comes from the Latin proles and suggests the idea of an animalistic fertility. As Merezhkovsky rightly noted, this term was applied especially to those whose only creative skill consisted of begetting children. These were men in body, but eunuchs in spirit. In its logical development, this trend leads toward that ideal society in which there are no more classes, no men or women, but instead comrades, or asexual cells belonging to the same immense anthill. Politically speaking, the demographic explosion is doomed to create a congestion that in turn produces critical international solutions, resulting in wars that cannot be justified by any higher right or idea. Here, the mere quantity and condition of a proletarian nation do not correspond to a right or an idea. In regard to military solutions, we should also keep in mind that the importance of the numerical factor has become relative due to the increasingly technical nature of recent wars. Aside from war, the population overload can only lead some countries to seek space among other peoples, as an emigrating exportation of cheap labor, who are eventually destined to lose their identity and be scattered among other peoples. As the congestion continues, the fatal effects will be inner crises and social tensions representing manna from heaven for the leaders of Marxist subversion. Again, anyone can see what negative consequences come from an indiscriminate population increase. As I said, this increase results in a numeric superiority of the inferior proletarian strata when a democratic regime is in power. In a democracy, it is numbers that ensure power through universal suffrage. destroying the limits through which, in other regimes, the numerical growth of the base did not concern the minority or the elite that was in firm control of key positions of the state. End quote. So here he opens up with, like, we need to stop thinking that there is power in numbers. Past conquerors didn't conquer because they had overpopulation. They didn't conquer because they needed space. They conquered because of a higher calling and qualification, and they were able to rule despite the fact they did not have numbers. They were minorities in foreign lands, but they were able to rule not on account of numbers, but on account of their spiritual ideals and their capacity and their own superiority in combat and things of that nature. Well, I think that this ought to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, because the truth is that numbers count for an awful lot in conflicts, wars of attrition, and in endless floods of immigration. Numbers in combat and numbers in day-to-day life, in voting, which we're stuck with for the time being. Numbers actually matter an awful lot. And having your nation flooded by foreign peoples until the point when the foreign invaders become the majority is something to consider. That is a numbers question, and it is not a insignificant question. It's not the case that we want to become ruling minorities in our own lands, even if that was what we could anticipate, which it isn't. His dismissal of the numbers game to me seems a little brash and incorrect. But he does make important points that really it's the lower classes of people and it's the third world countries that reproduce most rapidly. And so when we try to win a breeding contest, when we try to win a numbers game in that manner, what really happens is we expand upon the least among us. You've seen the movie Idiocracy and the way it opens up. The lower classes repopulate themselves. They procreate at a much higher rate, and the upper classes procreate at a much lower rate. They're plotting, they're planning, they've got all sorts of hesitations and qualifications and reserves about whether they have all their ducks in a row, and whether they have the extra room in their house, and they have all these reasons why they can't do it now, and the lower classes are just popping them out like rabbits. That just increases the power of the lower classes and decreases the power of the upper classes. And is that really what we want? So he talks more about births and birth rates and populations, but I'm not going to read any more of this section. I'm going to close it out there. Thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.